Welcome and good afternoon. Thank you for joining us at the 5th Nesta Talks To event this autumn. These events are put on by Nesta and designed to be a conversation with today's most interesting thinkers, focused on the big topics that define our future. We're really pleased to be welcoming Azeem Azhar today to discuss whether our societies can stand the pace of technological change. Before I introduce Azeem, I should introduce Nesta and myself. Nesta is a UK-based innovation agency for social good. In our new strategy, published this year, we have 3 missions: giving every child a fairer start, helping people to live healthier lives, and building a more sustainable economy. I'm Laurie Smith from Nesta's Discovery Hub, and I lead lots of our Foresight research. Nesta's Discovery Hub systematically scans for emerging trends, technologies and interventions, embedding strategic foresight at the heart of the organisation, and helping us to anticipate new challenges and opportunities. Now to Azeem, who's on a mission to explain how our societies and ways of life will change under the force of exponential technologies. He does this from the vantage point of over a 25-year career as an entrepreneur, investor, and analyst in the tech industry. Today, he runs the highly cited newsletter Exponential View that has 187,000 subscribers, and he also hosts the Exponential View podcast. In his new book, Exponential, which we'll discuss today, he outlines the 4 areas of technology that are accelerating at exponential rates: AI and computing, biology, renewable energy, and manufacturing. A few housekeeping notices. Initially, Azeem's going to spend 5 or maybe 10 minutes providing a short overview of the book. Then I'll speak with him for about 20 minutes or so. We'll then move on to questions from the audience. There's a handful of questions that have been submitted in advance, and please join in the conversation in the comments box on the right-hand side of your screen and ask any questions throughout the event. Also, if you'd like to view closed captions, make them accessible via a link in the description. So, over to you, Azeem.
Well, thanks so much, Laurie. Thanks, Nesta. And thanks to everybody who is giving up lunchtime to join this discussion. I hope you managed to get a sandwich or something at your desk or couch or bed, wherever you happen to be sitting in these days of hybrid working. It's really exciting to be here and to talk about my book, as all authors do. I have to hold up a copy of it. Please do go and find a copy. If you do read it, read books on the Kindle ebook reader. It is available for 99p at the moment, which is, considering I've put many, many years of work into it, feels like a real bargain. So just in my opening remarks, just a few minutes, I'll try not to go to 10 minutes. Having spoken to Laurie, I'm pretty certain the discussion will be more interesting once he and I are having a conversation. But let me frame what the book and the thesis of the argument is. And much of this, I think, will be familiar to you because you live in this world. I wanted to draw attention to how technologies shape us and the societies in which we live, but also make the point that not only does technology shape society, society can shape technology. And that second aspect is a part of the debate that is often lost when we live in these moments of frenetic change and the occasional hagiography of the technologist and the technology entrepreneur. And it's important to understand that framing, because I think that we find ourselves today at or just past a really, really important turning point. And that turning point is a shift, a phase transition in the way that we'll order society because of the capabilities and impacts of a range of technologies that are improving at exponential rates. The relationship between technologies and social, political, economic affordances is a really important one to understand. So I'm speaking to you today from grey Cricklewood. I'm in the borders, actually, between Cricklewood and Golders Green in North London. And where my house stands today was only 120 years ago fields. So I'm somewhere between zone 2 and zone 3 of the tube network. And yet my house was, almost within living memory on farmland. By 1930 or so, the house stood as it stands today, with pretty much the same floor plan. The roads were laid out as they are today. There was electricity coming into the home. In fact, it's the same mains connection that was laid nearly 100 years ago. There was a telephone system, and of course, there were cars plying the streets. In that short 30-year period, this farmland turned into something that's distinctly recognizable today. And the catalytic technologies of the time, the car and the internal combustion engine, the telephone and electricity, were responsible for shaping that world that looks so recognizable now. And those three general purpose technologies were so powerful that even 100 years after they had emerged into the world's largest companies were all connected, some sense, to being phone companies, electricity companies, or producing oil or building vehicles that use the internal combustion engine. So it's a remarkable period of time based on these GPTs, general purpose technologies. So the argument that I make today is that we're undergoing a transition that is at least as significant. I think it's more significant, and it's also driven and catalyzed by general purpose technologies. A general purpose technology is one which can be applied very, very widely in our economies, in many different industries and in many different parts of those industries. And the thing about general purpose technologies is that because they are so generalized and so available, they do create many, many potentials hither and thither and left and right. What's distinct about today's setup is that the general purpose technologies that I investigated, computing and AI, the ones that we're probably most familiar with, but also the new realms of biology, where we're able to rewrite what organisms do, and we can lean on the beauty and efficiency of nature to do other useful things for us. New energies and storage, and the most incipient of them all, which is what we're going to do in manufacturing through additive manufacturing, is that these technologies are improving on a price performance basis at exponential rates, which I mean at least 10% compounded improvement every year. Now, that's really important, because what happens is that you take a technology that is too expensive at one point, but because it improves in price by, say, 40, 45, 50% every year, which is what's happened for 50 or 60 years with computer power, at some point it becomes cost effective or better than the other way that we were using to achieve a particular goal. So at some point, computer power became so cheap that we now use it to create trivial filters on our social networks and on our cameras. And the amount of computing power we leverage to do that is greater than all the computing power that the world had at the time of the choose your moment in history, the Manhattan Project, the Apollo moon landings, whatever it happens to be. And so the second characteristic here is that these technologies get much, much cheaper. And because they get much cheaper, we will use them more widely in our economies more rapidly. And there are a number of other dynamics which we might jump into that I describe in the book that explain why this comes about and what the outcomes are for innovation and for change in the economy. So that's all good and well. We understand that technologies shift the way societies get structured. We can believe, and I argue and I demonstrate in the book, that the pace of change today is far faster than in previous times, and that this is driven by the fact that technologies are getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. The challenge is that the technologies will race away a bit like this sort of kind of curve on the cover, but the way in which we live in the world is governed by institutional norms. They are either very formal institutions, like things that perhaps have physical buildings, like the UN or the courts, or there might be formal institutions like legal systems or firms or employment contracts, as well as informal norms and customs and habits. Now, all of those things are really, really useful in making a society function, but they don't necessarily adjust as quickly as the potentials of the technology that we are dealing with today. And that is what I call the exponential gap, the gap between the potentials of the technology, how they get seized upon by particular groups and used extensively, how they demand different ways of management in the same way that we handle gaseous water known as steam very differently to how we handle liquid water. Both are useful, but they both need different regulatory mechanisms to be used safely. And the exponential gap is, for me, the descriptor, it's the analytic, and it's the cause of so much friction and change that we see, whether it's in industrial structure or in the labor markets or in geopolitics or in conflict or in the way our democracies function. And that the urgency that we need to act on is to find ways of closing that gap. So I've spoken for 6 minutes, and I'd love to bring Laurie back on and we can have a discussion.
Thank you, Azeem. So perhaps we can sort of start with the overall tenor of the book, or not only the book, but also, I suppose, to some extent, your podcast and newsletter. So in the round, you seem to sort of strike quite a positive tone about the future of technology. I suppose I was wondering what makes you, on balance, feel a bit optimistic?
Well, I'm not sure how optimistic I feel. When I've read the reviews of the book, I've been criticized for being too optimistic. I've been criticized for being too pessimistic. Those on the right have argued that this is full of socialist nonsense, and those on the left have said I'm far too sympathetic towards the market. So I'm, I think people have read into the book slightly different things coming from their own perspectives. My view is that we can observe underlying processes that show that these types of core technologies that are really interesting and powerful will be getting cheaper and cheaper, or the corollary of that is they're going to get more and more capable, and that is reason to be optimistic. It's reason to be optimistic because if you think about the human condition, for a long time it was determined by energy poverty and food poverty and vulnerability towards very, very simple diseases. And in large parts of the world, we've really, really tackled that. We still have much more work to do. But the reason one needs to temper sort of a starry-eyed optimism about technology saving everything is that technology is destabilizing and technology changes power relationships. And technology is designed by humans to do particular things. So it's not like manna from heaven or a bolt of lightning from Zeus. It is a fashioned, directed force. And the governance of that technology and the principles by which we build it and choose what to build and choose what we design to build and then choose how we manage it, it becomes really, really important. And that's the realm of politics. And so the question is, it's not so much whether we have a power, it's whether we can wield that power with a sense of justice and broader good. And those are the reasons why one might feel less optimistic, because there are signs that alongside all of the sort of headline numbers that have improved the human condition, there are many, many risks and problems baked into that.
Well, maybe being accused of both optimism and pessimism indicates you've got it about right. Perhaps I'm moving to sort of central thesis of your sort of thinking around sort of exponential technologies. I mean, what could those involved in innovation for social good learn from your book? What are the most important messages for them? So for organisations, say like Nesta or people involved in that sort of space.
Well, I think one of the key ones is an understanding of what will happen with the price and then the availability of these technologies, and what is maybe difficult and expensive today will be much, much cheaper in the future and actually much easier. And you can see that in just in the field of AI. I tell a story in the book about a school student called Laura O'Sullivan, and I met her at a science competition in Dublin that I'd been asked to go and sort of attend and look at. And at the time she was 17, and she had built a simple model machine vision system that could look at scans of cervical smears and with very, very high accuracy predict whether they would be anomalous or not. And the tools and techniques she used for this, which was her first ever programming project, I should say, were techniques that had been developed only 2 or 3 years earlier in a postgraduate research lab in California. And in the olden days, Laurie, 20 years ago, when I was in my late 20s, it didn't take 3 years for things to go from the lab to a high school project. It took decades. And so this idea that actually these high-end techniques become available very quickly, they also become not only cheaper, but easier, is a really important one to grasp. And I think the second thing that is perhaps less theoretical and more practical and tangible is this question of power. In one of the chapters of the book, I make a point that the companies that make use of these technologies well, they tend to have this increasing return to scale, which means an increasing returns of power. And there is a temptation when you look at questions of social good to say who best uses these technologies. And what one can often do then is look at the very largest technology companies in the world and say, well, we should partner with them. And my argument would be that you have to be very, very careful about that, because what we've observed is a tremendous shift of power, of legitimacy and accountability towards those companies, sometimes for the good, sometimes for ill. And if your default response is, I must work with one of the big five, I think what you do is you ignore some of the real benefits of these technologies, which is that they're democratized and they can be built with the tools that are available from the ground up.
That's really, really interesting. Just thinking about, again, sort of going back to the sort of thesis around sort of exponential technologies. There are sort of a number of experts, people like Robert Gordon and Tyler Cohen, who've sort of made the case that innovation's faltering. And how does this sort of thinking square with your own around technologies growing exponentially?
Well, I'm a bit simple-minded about this, and I look at the price, and I'm familiar with a lot of the research around the sort of sense that progress is getting more expensive in some ways. And if you look at some of that research, it's asking a slightly different question, which is, what is the gross total number of dollars required to make a scientific breakthrough, and is that number growing? And in many cases, it is growing. The question that I pose instead is, what's actually happening to the price of genome sequencing or cell programming or lithium-ion battery storage? And is that really declining by 15, 20, 30, 50, sometimes higher percent per annum? And that's what the historical data has said. And then when you look at what the underlying process of that price decline is, it can often be, it's not necessarily related to scale. And I'm not really interested in scale effects that result in price decline. That point being that if you buy 1 million of widgets from a supplier, they'll give them to you at a lower per unit cost than if you buy 10. I'm not thinking about that question. I'm really thinking about this question that as we develop these technologies, we get better at making them, and we go through what's known as a learning curve. And it's that learning curve effect, which was described by Theodore Wright in 1936, that is a better predictor of how the price of these technologies will decline. And I think the thing that's fascinating is that that's what what predicts them very well, and that's what we see across all of these different domains that are very, very different. 3D printing to lithium-ion batteries to wind turbines to cell programming to silicon chips. They are not the same thing, and yet Wright's law is a strong predictor of what goes on. And so I think we can coexist with the argument that it gets more expensive to make certain scientific breakthroughs. We can even coexist with the idea that we're kind of running out of new ideas in physics and we need a new paradigm because we're sort of hitting on the door. But for the intents and purposes of looking at how societies might shift and what those underlying technologies will do, we've got a good data set, and I think quite a reasonable predictive model to argue that this can continue for a little while longer.
So when looking, in that sort of data-driven approach, you presumably looked at a number of different technologies to select your 4. Were there any, when you looked at them, that surprised you, that you thought, that should definitely be on the list of the 4, and actually it turned out not to be? Or something that's in your list that really surprised you when you actually sort of dug into it?
When I started doing my research, which was really quite informal because I was writing the newsletter, one of the things that kept cropping up was the death of Moore's law. So Moore's law is a relationship that has described how silicon chips get smaller, or the components on silicon chips get smaller every year or so. And as they get smaller, that means the chips themselves get faster for a fixed cost. And it's why, your iPhone is hundreds of thousands times more powerful than, the first computer that I had in 1981. And people were talking about the death of Moore's law. And the reason they were saying this is that the process of miniaturization was going to hit against the limits of physics, right? The electrons were going to get quantum drunk and wander places they shouldn't do in these transistors on silicon chips. And as I dug deeper into this idea of the death of Moore's law, the theory was really well held, but it wasn't evidenced by what was happening in the availability and price of computing for developers and for machine learning engineers. They were actually continually being able to access more and more cheap computational power. And so that was in a sense was a surprise, because it was an inversion of the general sort of received wisdom. And it's not that those things in the received wisdom weren't directionally important, and it wasn't getting harder and harder for chip companies to make that measure of progress. It was, but the gains were significant enough that they were still able to. And then back in 2011, when deep learning emerged as a sort of viable technology, it created an entirely new use case for computing cycles. And actually, we were able to jump an energy level and use a different architecture for silicon chips, moving from a CPU architecture to a GPU architecture. But the GPU architecture and many of the GPUs were built on much larger circuits that were technologies that were actually a few years older. But the difference in the design delivered the exponentiality. So that was quite a surprising result, I think, because it flies in the face of all the headlines and stories in New Scientist and MIT Tech Review and Nature saying the death of Moore's law is upon us. And in some sense it might be, but the exponentiality in computing hasn't come to an end.
And in your introduction, you sort of you highlight the exponential gap between the sort of rapid growth of technologies and the much slower pace of institutional change. I suppose as someone who works for sort of an innovation agency with a public purpose, I suppose I'd be really interested to learn what social innovation could help do to try to bridge that gap.
That's a really great question. I think one of the major reasons we have a gap is because of agency and participation. One of the things that didn't make it into the book because it had to be a certain length, but it was a beautiful chapter, was a long history of the idea of technology and how its meaning shifted over the past thousands of years, and how at some point in the last 150 years or so, technology started to not be a process and a sort of a craft that we could all participate in, but become an autonomous force of its own that had to be ridden by those who could ride it for the rest of our benefit. And that message became progressively reinforced through the 20th century and reinforced increasingly through advertising and media representation. When you get to the 70s, computing was very much a hobbyist activity that anyone could really participate in. But as soon as the sort of money started to show, systems started to get locked down. And actually the experience that my kids have using computers today, much more powerful than the computers I had when I started, is a much less powerful experience than the one I had, because I got to program the computers and I got to wonder about them. And that change, I think, has been a real issue. So from a social innovation perspective, I think one of the things I try to argue in the book is about reclaiming the art of technology and the act of technology and encouraging participation and trying to become a maker rather than a taker.
That's really interesting. Another interesting sort of idea you mentioned in the book, it's this idea of sort of social fact, like Moore's law you mentioned. So things that are true because we almost make them true. I mean, could this idea be used to ensure exponential technologies benefit citizens? And if so,
how? Absolutely. I mean, it's Moore's law is this amazing social fact. It coordinated so many different participants in the semiconductor industry, and it became their clock speed. And the process is so complicated to make chips, and it involves so much specialist process and technology. It really requires a lot of different people to come together and believe it. I think we're starting to see the emergence of some new social facts around predominantly around things like sustainability, most broadly. But just to give you one example, the idea of the circular economy is something that, if we start to all believe in it, is something that we can then believe and then make happen. And over the last 4 years, I've observed in occasional snapshots when I've been looking at the circular economy, the increasing breadth with which many different companies and groups are talking about it, and talking about it as something that needs to come about and needs to happen. So there's not really a sort of underlying theory that is a sort of Homo economicus style theory that says this is how it will be. It's really more a social fact that's coming about. And in fact, I had a discussion with a Goldman Sachs banker about 2 weeks ago who was talking about the importance of the circular economy. So I think there are, just as an example, ways in which circular social facts can emerge and they can shift our priorities.
That's really interesting. That's something I hadn't thought of at all. I mean, one thing I thought was great to see in your book was you sort of, as well as sort of offering sort of diagnosis, you also offer solutions. I suppose what role do you think citizens have in developing these solutions?
Well, I should say something about the solution. So Jeff Mulgan, who I think used to run Nesta until a couple of years ago, sent a tweet yesterday going, I loved his book, but he doesn't give enough solutions. So let's say I prefer the new Nesta that says you give solutions over the old Nesta that says you don't give solutions. But hi, Jeff. Thank you for the wonderful comments. And there are, there are some directions I put out there. I wanted to be a bit careful about this because I really think that the solutions are driven by the experience and the context and the position, location, and resources of particular groups. And so I don't think that there are necessarily single top-down solutions that I should strongly merit. And what I try to do is find that balance between values and principles and tools and specific examples which have worked in particular contexts. And I think that's a really important way of thinking about how we address this this age, because it is really a common theme, I think, is this idea of agency and subsidiarity, right? So agency for the individual and subsidiarity for decisions to be made more proximately to where they can best be made.
And what do you, and sort of, I realise you've talked about sort of those solutions being sort of more sort of localized. But what one of those most excites you? What do you think is the sort of most radical yet credible?
Well, the one I like the most, I don't know if it's the most radical, is the idea of shifting how we think about resource allocation and resource management. So for the bulk of the last certainly 60 years, we have divided the tools for resource management in society between the market and the state. And the dominant monetarist neoliberal consensus has been the market's really good at resource allocation for efficiency. And for things a market doesn't do well, chuck it over to the state, which will just kind of deal with it. And we've sort of relegated the role of the state. Now, there's obviously much more we can do with the state, and I think that thinkers like Carlota Perez and Mariana Mazzucato and Bill Janeway and many others have argued that the importance of those types of interventions. And indeed, the Goldman Sachs banker who I spoke to 2 weeks ago was saying, well, we need much better work from the state to kind of clear some paths for decarbonisation. But there's another area, mechanism for resource management, which has been overlooked, which is the commons. And the idea of having a self-governing group that can manage resources for its own benefit. And, commons thinking is an analysis sprung up in its sort of formal way, most famously through Elinor Ostrom, who was a Nobel laureate, who started to do this work about the same time that the sort of monetarist consensus was taking hold in policy circles in the early 70s in the US and then in the UK. And in her work, she identifies it quite well that outside of the market and outside of the state, we can find ways of governing our resources. And I think the exponential age provides many, many tools where we could govern our resources that way. That's what open source software governance looks like. That's what we could start to imagine happening on chain in these sort of decentralized blockchains as well. And the idea of having common pools and common resources, whether it's data commons and data trusts, I think is something that sets the ground for many, many more public or semi-public goods upon which other things can be built.
And that leads us really nicely into some of the questions from the audience, some of which were sort of sent in advance. We've got a question here from talking of sort of citizens and sort of the commons and governance. We've got a question here from Andy Matthias from Vincit, who asks about sort of digital democracy tools of the 21st century, which you talk about a little bit. I mean, are there any tools you think are particularly fruitful or have value, or perhaps appear to have value but don't actually have so much value?
I mean, it's a really, really great question, and posed at the point where the role of the social media platforms in skewing and democratic debate is becoming pretty clear now, and I think that there is a growing concordance that upsets the way in which citizens have been informed or misinformed. But the question, I think, is really about how do we, what kind of arenas now lend themselves to some form of democratic accountability and governance, and what kind of tools can we use? I think one interesting area, just on the former, is that many of these technologies are increasingly local. So decentralized solar power and localized battery storage provides some measure of energy self-sufficiency to a particular community. You're starting to see that happen in places like South Australia. There's an experiment in Cornwall as well. And then you start to ask the question, well, if these are entirely local resources now, do we need to have ways of managing those and creating the policies for those that are local rather than national? And that friction is starting to emerge. There's a battle at the moment between the city of Cape Town and Eskom, which is the national power system in South Africa, because Eskom is sort of dealing with all sorts of brownouts on power, but Cape Town actually has enough renewable power to keep itself running. And the rules are not designed to make that happen. So that's one area, which is where are the new loci of democracy. And then when we think about what are the tools that we can use, there are experiments that are going on in Taiwan around getting people to sort of engage regularly through digital tools and discussions around key issues. But the thing that I find most interesting is not specifically a kind of a technologically driven approach. It's the idea of deliberative democracy through either citizens' juries or permanent standing citizens' councils, which can actually debate and discuss what the question is. And that question can then be put, as it was in Ireland around the abortion issue a couple of years ago, to a referendum. And it was pretty exciting that actually since the book came out, I think the city of Paris in the last month or so has announced a standing citizens jury to evaluate issues and figure out what the questions should be. So I don't think all of this gets done through technology, and maybe the interface is a sort of, a smartphone interface. But we do need some new tools, and we're seeing some experiments around it.
And once I thought it was interesting to sort of raise citizens' juries. So one challenge around those is their sort of legitimacy, because obviously you only have a subset of the citizens. What are your thoughts on that sort of legitimacy question for them?
That's in the jury design, and it's also in the in what you ask the jury to do. So what I've seen work at a distance. I'm a trustee at the Ada Lovelace Institute, and one of the researchers there, Rima Patel, runs a lot of citizen juries on key issues that are complicated and difficult, like biometrics and citizen biometrics. And the way that process works is to bring some kind of representative sample of the citizenry through a deliberative process that might take a little bit of time. It might take many, many hours or a few days to identify what the key issues might be. And then you can take those key issues away to decision makers. And I think that the case study in Ireland is a very good one around the abortion debate. And if you imagine, I mean, we had a referendum, some of you may remember a few years ago, around the EU. I mean, it was an absurd question to put to a big population. Having a referendum about EU membership is not an absurd issue, but the question is, what is the question that you put, and how do you frame that, and what might a citizen jury have done? I mean, a citizen jury might have, ahead of that, worked out what the issues ought to be and how the question ought to be framed in a way that is also a little bit descriptive about the direction of what happens given a yes or a no vote given that question. So I think that's in the design of the system. I don't think they're inherently problematic.
Right, that's helpful. And we've got another question that was sort of submitted in advance, which sort of relates sort of about education. This is from Peter Findlay at JISC, who's interested in strategic approaches to use technology in education and foresight. Do you have any thoughts about those approaches? Are they something that feature in your thinking?
Well, I think it depends where you are in the world. Again, on the cutting room floor is the section on online education in China, and one of the things that the Chinese have obviously had to struggle with is the vast inequality of experience between the children who live in the tier 1 cities and those who live in tier 4 or in rural areas. And for the last 15 years, they've actually had a very large scale online learning program. And it's incredibly heartwarming when you read, I'm reading the translated interviews with some of the students, and they'd say things like, well, I come from a small village and I felt that I was sitting in one of the best schools in Shanghai because of this. And they also had, so they have personal stories that are very powerful, and they also had strong case studies of how it had improved economic outcomes and professional and life outcomes because of this. Now that's China, and that's a Chinese context. If we look at what's going on in the UK, I think the thing that I'm concerned with is that a lot of the IT skills that my kids have been taught have literally been things like they've been taught things like PowerPoint and Microsoft Word and font selection, which as well as programming and computational principles. And the latter is really brilliant. And that idea that you can understand the kind of core elements of computational thinking, and then I think also of data-based thinking. So how do you think with data? These are kind of fundamental skills that enable you move forward. Now, I'm not close enough to the sort of broader spectrum of what every child gets taught and how they get taught. But I think that the understanding those core skills becomes much, much more important than a familiarity with an interface or a particular application.
And this speaks to a sort of question from Rohit Talwar from Fast Future Research, who sort of talk, I suppose this can relate to education, sort of about what additional steps we could take to accelerate social understanding and adaptation. I mean, how does that sort of fit in and sort of in relation to education?
It's a really, really good question. And, I think about what happened with, I think about storytelling here. And one of the really powerful things that emerged when in the early 1970s, when we moved to sort of this very technocratic version of market capitalism, was that Milton Friedman was a great storyteller, and he told stories well, and his stories launched 1,000 ships. Of course, there were policymakers and funders and public affairs people behind that, pushing things and making this happen. But the stories become really, really important. If you think about Margaret Thatcher and her ability in 10 words to frame an issue, it was very, very powerful. And then if you look at what happened in that period of 2016 to 2019 around the climate crisis, it wasn't that the science changed. It was that Greta Thunberg was able to tell a story in a way that resonated with people. And so I think one of the things that we are slightly in need of is a storytelling around this, and a storytelling that is not the hagiography of the single technology founder. I'm not sure Aaron Sorkin would make The Social Network today the way he did 10 years or so ago. It's not that type of storytelling, nor is it the type of storytelling saying, we've got 50 Android tablets or Chromebooks or something that have been delivered. We need to figure out a way of capturing this opportunity in very, very simplistic and appealing and emotive ways. Now, I'm probably too nerdy to be able to do that. I mean, I hope my book is accessible enough to give people some of the tools, and maybe it can inspire someone who can tell that story and capture that moment well.
That's really interesting, because you mentioned sort of Jeff Mulgan previously, and he talked in a paper a while back about sort of social imagination and how we have sort of a great technological imagination and can come up with these fantastic technologies, but our ability to imagine how society could fundamentally change is much more limited. We assume things are going to be quite similar in the future. Do you think that deficit? Do you think that deficit exists, or do you think that's a sort of misreading?
No, I think he's absolutely, I mean, he's right about everything apart from what he said about my policies in my book. Jeff is a brilliant mind, and we're lucky to have him. Imagine the goldfish in the bowl, and I'm the goldfish, and you come to me and you say, would you like me to would you like me to change the water in your bowl? And I would not have any concept of what the water is, nor would I have a concept of changing that water. So then the question is, well, how can we think about this? And there are a couple of approaches. One is the approach of using fiction and imaginations as a way of identifying potential futures. And I think that has to be a collaborative and engaged exercise, because a lot of science fiction misunderstands the intersection between the technologies and how they change our values and what we want to think about. The Jetsons bubble car is a really a kind of a poor example compared to some of the science fiction that comes out of other arenas where you're starting to understand the social and economic impacts of this and how that changes the way people behave. So I think there is something to be done around this lens of fiction, something that I've read recently, and I spoke with the author Kim Stanley Robinson for his book Ministry for the Future, has a style of fiction that's only looking out 20 or 25 years that describes and frames what potential avenues or futures could look like. And I think that is one tool that we might be able to use.
And that's really interesting, because it speaks to some work we've done at Nesta about involving citizens in those conversations, and those sort of conversations and stories about the future. Which brings us sort of back nicely to a question that Nico McDonald put in the chat.
Hi, Nico.
And he says you advocate democracy, and he sort of was interested in your sort of views on, I suppose, the EU referendum, and should we have a similar sort of, because you mentioned the EU referendum, and should you have a similar sorts of referendum around net zero? What's your thinking on that?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the question is. Much more about what the question would be. My take on the EU referendum is that the question, you can put things to referendum, but you have to be very, very careful about the question that you put, and you have to frame it in a way that has gone through some sort of process that allows us to understand what the real issue is. Really, really complicated questions should be with very, very great care be put to a very, very broad populace in a yes/no answer. And one could imagine a net zero question being posed as, should we head to net zero rapidly, or should we allow ourselves to be incinerated on an uninhabitable planet? Could be one way of putting it. Or the other way of putting it could be, should we worsen our living standards and not be allowed to go on holiday? Or should we just go as we are and rely on getting wealthier to tackle the adaptation to climate change? I mean, it's the same issue framed very, very differently. So I'm not sure that there's necessarily a good way of asking that particular question as a referendum. And I also think, I'm not sure that policymakers have what question they would ask, because there is a complex system here. And if you want to build a fossil fuel plant today, the capital markets will charge you 15 to 16% higher interest rates than if you want to build a wind farm. And if you want to hire people, great engineers and brilliant graduates, you're going to find it easier if your company is somehow working on the net zero transition or on decarbonisation than if you're looking to start up defunct coal seams in Norfolk or off the coast of Cumbria. And so there's a sense in which so many parts of the system have shifted. I'm not sure what the question would necessarily be.
Maybe an opportunity to use some of those more sort of participatory, deliberative approaches.
Yeah, possibly.
So we've got another question here from Matt Seedon, who says, what does he say? He says, for institutions to evolve sufficiently quickly, it seems the principles underpinning them require more explicit articulation, so they can be more nimbly manifested in a new form. Put another way, it seems the philosophical consensus-ish behind our institutions needs to be broadened if those institutions are to take a new form, especially if we assume different people are involved. And he's curious if you've thought about this at all.
It's a great question, Matt, and I'm going to commend you to go and pick up a copy of the book. I do try and tackle that. And I think one of the things that's most important is to start with the fundamental principles and to return to them, because if you can be principles driven, you can ultimately be a little bit more agile in your application of those judgments. I think the challenge with being principles driven is that it requires a lot of trust in those institutions, right? Because they're going to make judgments against those principles rather than against a checklist. So I do agree with you. Principles need to drive that. And then when we look at the question of what the institutions need to be, is it going to be that we can adapt existing institutions. Can we adapt the Bank of England or the Fed or the SEC to deal with the emerging challenges of cryptocurrencies and decentralized finance, or will we need a new style regulator? The UK, of course, smushed together Oftel and the ITC about 20 years ago to produce Ofcom, because they thought that the issues between broadcasting and telecoms were going to converge. And so they took that approach. Or will we need to find entirely new institutions and have those emerge? And I think we're seeing a mix of all of that happening. So examples of new institutions would be things like the 3Cs group, which is a bunch of countries like Estonia running southwards that is trying to build a regional bloc. And you're seeing a lot of regional blocks, this sort of mini-lateralism. Arguably, what's emerging with that horrible new acronym, what is it, ANZUCAS or something, between Australia, the UK, and the US, which is sort of starting to emerge. And so, my sense is one needs to have principles, and then we're going to be faced with a question of how much trust do we then have, and then we have to decide what can we refashion and what do we have to build anew. And if we're going to build anew, how ambitious can we be with our first iteration?
And moving back to one of the issues in the circular economy, which you raised earlier, we've got a question here from Jasmine S, who asks, how do we encourage organizations to build a circular economy? It's a conversation that's been around for a few years, so how can we encourage more rigor in its adoption?
There's a number of things. Individual consumers can play a role because they can ask the question, and they can ask the question more frequently, and even as small shareholders, you can ask that question. And I wouldn't understate the power of the consumer. I think it's been one of the myths of the climate change debate that only policy can make a difference. We actually see people choosing to change their behavior, and that being reflected in aggregate enough to shift where capital gets allocated. And ultimately, capital is the sort of blood that pumps the change through our economies. So if you think about the shifts, 17% decline in meat eating in the UK over the past several years, is not being driven by policy, but by consumer choice. And the consequence then is you get the big food companies saying, this is a massive trend, we've got to invest in it. And they start to make it real. Or if you look at the switch from petrol and diesel cars to electric vehicles, go to Norway, which is a much bigger country than the UK. It's a much colder country. So all the arguments about electric vehicles not functioning well in cold, long journeys apply in Norway much more than they do here. And Norwegians love their long journeys. In 2016, about 15 to 20% of new car registrations were electric vehicles. By September 2021, that's only 5 years later, that was closer to 90%. And my reckoning would be that some early point in 2022, virtually no non-electric vehicles will be bought in Norway. Now, the policy is to ban those from 2025, the sale of them. So that's happening faster than the policy. And the subsidies have roughly been the same over that time. What's actually driven this has been consumer behavior, and then a consumer switch turning into a fad and an ephemera, more than a fad, sorry, a fad, a craze, and a kind of permanent change in behavior. So there are things that we can do as consumers as well, alongside where and then our policymakers will read from that.
We're almost at time, but I'm going to use the chair's prerogative and slip in one last question. There's only a short amount of time for an answer, but right at the beginning of the book, you mentioned getting a Sinclair ZX81 in your youth. And I suppose I was wondering, what might some child get for Christmas this year that might turn out to be a new exponential technology? Have you still?
Well, it better not be my camera, which is just frozen. Laurie's switching cameras. So much for the external camera. I mean, I think we want to give people things that they can tinker with. Kids need to have things that they can tinker with and explore in different directions. And we've seen things like, the Raspberry Pi and come out. But I suspect that there's quite an interesting set of biohacking things that are emerging in in that community out in the US. And I would love kids to be able to play around and ask questions in that new vista, which is a better understanding of biology. And this is not to create strange genetically modified puppies, but just to give you the basic fundamentals of what's possible.
Well, thank you so much, Azeem, for sparing the time to speak with me and to all of us. I can genuinely recommend the book, which I think provides an excellent overview of how our societies are struggling to keep up with the exponential force of technological change. To the audience, please do fill in a short survey. There's a link that's going to be shared in the chat. I think it's also available on the events description. Our next Nesta Talks to event will take place on Thursday, the 11th of November, where our CEO, Ravi Gurumurthy, will be speaking to Christopher Snowdon and Dolly Theis on should the government decide what we eat. Finally, I'd like to thank everyone in our audience for tuning in and their thoughtful questions, both now and those that are posted in advance. Azeem, was there anything else you sort of wanted to add that you think we have?
No, I mean, it's been a real pleasure, and thank you for the great questions. And you can follow me on Twitter, AZEEM. And just as a reminder, if you do buy the ebooks and you like ebooks, you can pick it up for 99p at the big ebook store from Seattle. But no, it's been lovely. Thank you, Laurie.
Thank you very much, Azeem.
Okay.
Well, everyone else.
Thank you.